Hi, this is Jeff Sachs of WebYeshiva with a special installment to wrap up this segment of our Halakhic Man series. We're meeting on a Thursday night. We've added one extra class before Tisha B'Av in order to finish up part one of Halakhic Man. I mentioned, I'm sure more than once, that Halakhic Man is a somewhat lopsided essay. I mean, it's printed in book form, but really it's a long essay. It's divided into two parts. The first part, which has 15 chapters, runs for something like 95 pages. And it's this overarching description of these archetypical characters, the homo religiosus, the religious personality, the cognitive man, the more scientific personality, and of course the great character of Halakhic Man, who we have focused much of our attention on, trying to understand his characteristics largely by way of comparison to the other two supporting characters in the work. And now in chapter 15, at the end of this long part one, we summarize a little bit, and we focus on one particular trait which has been not treated until now. And then part two of the essay, which is only about 37, 38 pages long, is entitled Halakhic Man, His Creative Capacity. And it's the difference between macro and micro. The first longer section, part one, is this overarching, sweeping description. And then we take one particular, perhaps the most significant feature of Halakhic Man's personality, which is his creativity, which we have addressed in the course of part one, and we give it a finer, we paint it with a finer brush. So tonight we're going to finish part one. Hopefully, starting during Elul, we'll continue into part two, which will of course take us far less time than we've dedicated this year to part one. And as we begin, I of course just want to thank our good friends Michael and Tiffany Beta, who sponsored this series in memory of the late and lamented Rabbi Ezra Labaton, Zichron Livracha. I've made these little remarks at the beginning of most of these archives over the course of the semester, but I remind you of this link, WebYeshiva.org /Rabbi Labaton, where you can access more information and then links to some of Rabbi Labaton's teaching and scholarship, some of which was, of course, dedicated to the topics that we've been talking about through our study of the Ish HaHalakha. Chapter 15. Halakhic Man does not quiver before any man. He does not seek out compliments, nor does he require public approval. If he sees there are fewer and fewer men of distinguished spiritual rank about him, then he wraps himself in his mantle and hides away to the 4 cubits of halakha. He knows that the truth is a lamp unto his feet, and the halakha a light unto his path. His whole being loathes idlers, wastrels, loafers. Piety is not based on knowledge of the piety that is not based upon knowledge of the Torah is of no consequence in his view. A point that we touched on last time, and now he's going to expand further here, that just like emotion that doesn't come through a knowledge, through cognition, either knowledge of Torah or knowledge of the world, is a flash in the pan. It's to be looked at with great suspicion. So too piety. Now, who could argue against piety? Righteousness. But righteousness has to emanate from within the Torah. Now, this is related to a topic that we've discussed in the past. I mentioned to you Rabbi Lichtenstein's very important essay, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, the Rav's son-in-law, of course, very important essay, Is There an Ethic Independent of the Halakha? The degree to which Halakha is coterminous with our sense of ethics. It seems here that the Rav is making an argument that halakha is the definition of ethics, although he's going to define it in a very particular way. There can be no fear of God without knowledge, and no service of God without the cognition of halakhic truth. Ein bor yirei chet v'lo am haaretz chasid. He quotes the Mishnah in Avot that a person who is crude has no yirat chet, has no fear of sin, and somebody who's ignorant can't be pious. So that somebody who has the marks of piety but is ignorant of larger principles, there's something lacking in his piety, which is not to say that good deeds are not inherently worthwhile regardless. The Gemara's discussion about the relationship between lishma and shelo lishma, shemitok shelo lishma balishma. Even a improperly motivated good deed has value, but we're here talking on a plane of an ideal. The old saying of Socrates that virtue is knowledge is strikingly similar to the stance of Halakhic Man. Now, this notion this very well-known notion of Socrates, that virtue is knowledge, that the knowledge, principally the knowledge of good and bad. In our sense, we talk about like the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the ability to differentiate between good and bad. The knowledge that is required in order to make those differentiations is itself the definition of virtue. Has very serious consequences, because within at least one reading of the Socratic worldview on this, and this is a central idea in Socrates' thought, sin is not a product of evil. Sin, vice, is a product of ignorance. Because if you were truly wise, you would be wholly virtuous, and you would have known what the right thing to do is, and you would have done it. So therefore, the consequence of sin should not be punishment, but should be education. This is a cornerstone in Socratic thought, and it's interesting that the Rav lays down this claim that it's strikingly similar to the stance of Halakhic Man, that virtue comes through knowledge. And virtue, or the appearance of virtue, the appearance of piety, which does not emanate from knowledge, is suspicious. This is reminiscent of a number of things, but it's certainly reminiscent of the Malbim very famously stated regarding Avimelech, when Avram and Sarah, when Sarah is taken captive, and when Avram says, say that you're my sister, Imrina Chotiat, and she's taken, and then Avimelech discovers that he almost sinned with a married woman. He says to Avram Avinu, why did you trick me? Why did you not tell me the truth? What, do you think that we would kidnap another man's wife? That do you think that we would have killed you, which apparently was what Avram was afraid of, that we would have killed you in order to have her? So Avram's response, Rak ein yirat Elokim b'makom hazeh, that there is no fear of God in this place, means, says the Malbim, that in a place, even an ethical society, but a place which is not governed by fear of God, all ethics, all morality is contingent. And anything can be justified when you don't have any kind of absolute red lines. Of course, the more contemporary and obvious example, which many have pointed out over the past 80 some odd years, is Nazi Germany, the most cultured, most refined civilization in history. Art and mathematics and science and economics and literature and music and you name it But of course, that very same society can be led down a path of the Holocaust. There's a famous line by the literary critic. By literary critic George Steiner, who happens to be Jewish. So Steiner, has in his book *Language and Silence*, has a quote where he says that the notion that part of the encounter with culture humanizes us. That part of the point of taking in the best that's been thought and said, and the great of literature and the great of culture, is that it humanizes us, it cultures us, has to be re-examined. And he has this very famous line where he says, "We come after," meaning after the Holocaust. We know now that a man can read Goethe and Rilke in the evening, then play Bach and Schubert, and then go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning. That culture does not, in and of itself, automatically create ethics and morals. That's similar. It's not identical, but it's similar to the claim the Rav is making here, that only knowledge, but here he's talking about the knowledge that emanates from the halakha. Now again, by halakha, I don't mean the Shulchan Aruch, although that's also part of it. But halakha here meaning the larger Jewish worldview. That's a point I've made many times. If you don't know what I'm talking about at this point, after 95 pages, so it is time for a review. I'll skip ahead a drop towards the top of page 90. The zeal for the truth that Halakhic Man senses, granted him by the Almighty. Thus, Halakhic Man will not be overly lenient, but at the same time, he will not be overly strict. Truth will call to account those who dishonor it, be they extreme rigorists or extreme permissivists. In other words, there's a halakha, and in some ways, it's like walking a tightrope. There's a halakha both in terms of ritual law. There's a halakha also in terms of ethical and interpersonal norms. And getting it right is a mark of truth. Chumrah, excessive stringency, is bad, just like unwarranted leniency is bad. Because even though on the side of chumrah, on the side of stringency, well, you can always say that we're covering all our bases, as opposed to excessive leniency, where one might actually come inadvertently to sin through not being stringent enough. So there is a difference, obviously, between them. But the Halakhic Man says both are wrong, because both are false. It's like imagine a surgeon. A surgeon has to remove a tumor. So the idea is to remove the tumor and nothing more. In other words, you have to remove the entirety of the tumor, because if you leave anything in, it's liable to continue to grow. But if you're if you say, well, I'm going to paint a much larger target, even though I think in reality that's what they do as a measure, you say, well, I'll just keep cutting, because better safe than sorry. So that's also damaging. It's also disfiguring. It also can lead to unwarranted side effects and complications. So the same thing with the halakha. The problem with excess chumrah is the same as the problem with excess kula. The problem with stringency is the same as the problem with leniency, because both of them are false. They're just flip sides of the same coin. Halakha is about truth. It's about getting it right and not tipping to one side or to the other. He has this story, a rather well-known story about Reb Chaim. There was a conference in St. Petersburg, and it was a time during the Russian Haskalah, the Enlightenment and the reforming movements, not Reform Judaism, but the reforming movements within Judaism. And there was an idea that the time when one's rights were accorded him by being part of the organized Jewish community, that the general government, in this case the Russian government, recognized your rights as a member of the organized Jewish community. So that was one way in which the Jewish community had pressure, could exert control over the Jews. So there was an idea that people who would not circumcise their children, because they were assimilationists, the children would not be enrolled on the communal registers. And this was done in order he mentions, for political and practical purposes, in order to encourage people to, even to the secularists, to circumcise their children. So Reb Chaim said, this is crazy. He says, show me where in the halakha it states that one who's not circumcised is not a member of the Jewish people. He says, obviously, circumcision is very important. And obviously, in this case, the child himself has not sinned because it's the father's obligation. Why should the child suffer? All types of people, all types of sinners are on these lists or on these registers as part of the Jewish community. Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelhu. The Jew, even a Jew who sins, is still a Jew. So Reb Chaim said, I understand like the political motives. I understand the idea that you're trying to encourage people to do bris milah, to do circumcision, and that this kind of threat, the stick here as opposed to the carrot, is meant to discourage people from being cavalier and to abandon the tradition. But the halakha is not some instrumental tool that you can wield in order to achieve other goals, even worthy goals. The halakha is truth. A Jew who is not circumcised is still a Jew. And that's the end of the story. On the basis of pure halakha, the Rav says, Reb Chaim was correct, and he would not sacrifice this halachic truth even for the sake of realizing the noblest of ideas. Halakhic Man implements the Torah without any compromises or concessions. For precisely such implementation, such actualization, is his ultimate desire, his fondest dream. When a person actualizes the ideal halakha in the very midst of the real world, he approaches the level of that godly man, the prophet, the creator of worlds. This harkens back to themes we saw earlier. It harkens back to the chart which I showed many times, showing Halakhic Man's desire to bring the ideal, abstract, pure halakha down into this world, and that is an act of creativity. Now he's foreshadowing the theme that's going to come in part 2, starting on page 99, and it's that way in which Halakhic Man is most like the Navi. Not the Navi who prophesizes, but the Navi who's a creative teacher. And that creativity is what interests the Halakhic Man. The ideals of righteousness, therefore the ideals of righteousness, which the Torah first introduced into the world, are implemented and actualized and concretized. Here we're at the top of page 91. By halachists in their purity and resplendent brilliance. Halakhic Man cannot be cowed by anyone. He knows no fear of flesh and blood, for he is not a creator. For is he not a creator of worlds, a partner of the Almighty in the act of creation? Through his dedication to halakha, which is truth, he doesn't fear other people, because he knows that he has truth on his side. even though, I mean, in parentheses we'll add, even though in this world, truth doesn't always win out. Truth doesn't always win out. Sometimes the forces of sheker, the falsehood, are ascendant. But that doesn't matter. Halakhic man is prepared to sacrifice all for the sake of truth, and that is because he knows that by adhering to the truth, which he can divine through his cognition, through his knowledge of what the halakha wants of us, he is therefore a partner of God. And that's a pretty good, how would you say, that's a pretty good team to be on. Precisely because he is free from fear of flesh and blood, he neither betrays his own mission nor profanes his holy task. He takes up his stand in the midst of the concrete world, his feet planted firmly on the ground. He publicly protests against the oppression of the helpless, the defrauding of the poor, the plight of the orphan. The rich are deemed as naught in his view. He is the father of orphans and the judge of widows. And then there's this lovely story that the Rav quotes his uncle, Rav Meir Bar Ilan, Rav Meir Berlin. Rav Meir Berlin was the son of the Netziv. The Netziv, of course, was the Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. And he had a son who was a son of his very old age, named Rav Meir Berlin, who Hebraized his name to Bar Ilan, after whom the university is named. He became a very great, important Zionist leader in the earlier mid-20th century. So the Rav says that his uncle, Rav Meir Bar Ilan, once told me that once Reb Chaim Brisk was asked to give what's the function of the rabbi. And Reb Chaim replied, the job of the rabbi is to redress the grievances of those who are abandoned and alone, to protect the dignity of the poor, and to save the oppressed from the hands of the oppressor. That's, a very interesting job description of the role of a rabbi. It's not to paskin shilas, it's not to do marital counseling, it's not to organize the mikvah and the eruv and the kashrus. It's not to give drushot. It's not to teach Torah. All things that rabbis, of course, need to do. Israel advocacy and who knows what. It's to do chesed. It's to be the CEO, the chesed executive officer of the Jewish community. Very famously, Reb Chaim willed that on his grave, they not write all types of fancy, flourishy type titles and things, but merely to write Chaim Brisker or Rav Chaim Brisker, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Ish Chesed, a man of kindness. He thought that was his greatest attribute, above his Torah, and his Torah was, of course, monumental. But above that is the Chesed, because the Chesed, the acts of kindness, the acts of redressing the grievances and protecting the dignity and saving the oppressed, that is the Torah in action. It's the implementation of the Torah. Not because the Torah is like, like if you learn Torah, you become a better person, although we like to think that that's the case. But because the Torah gives you, learning Torah, la'amita shel Torah, gives you a kind of moral intuition to what's desired of us. That comes through that knowledge, the knowledge of Tov v'Ra. Neither ritual decisions nor political leadership constitute the main task of Halakhic man. Far from it. The actualization of the ideals of justice and righteousness is the pillar of fire which Halakhic man follows. When he, as a rabbi and teacher in Israel, serves his community, more through the implementation of the principle of righteousness, man fulfills the task of creation imposed upon him, the perfect of the world, the perfection of the world under the dominion of halakha and the renewal of the face of creation. And then he points out all types of principles that bolster this, the idea of mitzvah haba v'avera, that if you do a sin, if you do a mitzvah which is accomplished through the performance of sin, that obviously negates the value of the mitzvah. The idea that someone who embarrasses someone else has no share in the world to come. These bolster the idea. Top of page 92. That dualism, the dualism between Ben Adam L'Chaveiro and Ben Adam L'Makom, between Hai Alma and Klape Shmaya, between our obligations in this world and our obligations to heaven. That dualism, which is so prevalent in other religions, which distinguishes between the man who stands before the Lord in an atmosphere suffused with heavenly solemnity and the man driving a hard bargain with his fellow in the marketplace, is totally foreign to the halakha. That distinction between, well, as it used to say, a Jew in the home and a man in the street, a Jew in the synagogue and a humanist in the outside, that religion can be relegated to certain arena, like the synagogue, like the Beit Midrash, but is absent elsewhere in the boardroom, in the factory. That is foreign to the halakha, because the halakha is all-encompassing. And again, here he's summarizing a theme that he spent a lot of time earlier in the essay elaborating on. We've already emphasized earlier that Judaism does not direct its glance upward, but downward. Well, at least the Judaism of Halakhic Man. That we're more concerned with this world than with the world to come. We're more concerned with this world than with heaven. The halakha does not aspire to a heavenly transcendence, nor does it seek to soar upon the wings of some abstract, mysterious spirituality. Right? And this is a summary of that idea of the chart of the one flowing up and one flowing down. Homo religiosus seeks to escape this world and unite with the transcendent, with the spiritual. Halakhic man is trying to call it down into this world. And similarly, just like when Halakhic man leaves the Beit Midrash to go to the factory, he takes the halakha with him. So too the other way around. When Halakhic man enters the synagogue or study house, he does not leave his this worldly life behind. Right? It flows in both directions. Jewish prayer is replete with requests regarding bodily needs, healing and prosperity, political freedom, good and peaceful life, and the such. So our religion is suffused with the nitty-gritty of day-to-day, and the nitty-gritty of day-to-day is infused with religion. Halakha imposes itself on every nook and cranny of daily life. This strange, disturbing dualism that blossoms forth in other religions is grounded in the fragmentation of life into many different sectors. And that is not the view of Homo religiosus. For Halakhic men. For Homo religiosus, however, the world of prayer, here at top page 93, for Homo religiosus, on the other hand, the world of prayer and the world of reality have nothing to do with each other. Homo religiosus enters his sanctuary humble and contrite in a mood of submission and humility. In this religious atmosphere, filled with the thick clouds of incense and the echoes of hymns of angels and seraphim, he divests himself of his arrogance and his rigid, unbending character and becomes the very model of meekness, self-effacing and bowed down. And he leaves the same way he entered, humble and submissive. However, no sooner does he step outside into that noisy, clamorous street than he reverts back to his original persona, to his previous haughty and conceited self-centeredness. In other words, the dualism allows you to have a religious life which has no chance of impacting your larger worldview, which has no chance of informing your behavior outside of the parameters of the area you've carved off as your religious life. You go into your place of worship. It seems he's describing a church here, although it needn't be so. Could also be a synagogue. And that's the exercise of your religious life. But since it's divided between religious life and secular life, it's not going to spill over back into the secular world. Then he mentions this, and here he's clearly speaking about, as a Christian or Catholic counts and lords back in the old Eastern Europe. How many noblemen bowed down before the cross in a spirit of abject submission and self-denial, confessed their sins with scalding tears and bitter cries, and in the very same breath, as soon as they left the dim precincts of the cathedral, order that innocent people be cruelly slain. We have here a manifestation of a deep fissure in one's psychic identity. I'm reminded of the concluding scene in The Godfather, if you recall, when Michael Corleone has become the Godfather, and there's one of the greatest scenes in cinema where he's serving as the Godfather at the baptism of one of his nephews, I think, and the camera keeps cutting back and forth between the scene of the baptism where he's standing there as the Godfather for this nephew in the church. They're doing the ceremony with the water and the whatnot, the mass, and then you see the hitmen being sent out at Michael's command to wipe out the heads of the 5 families. Who, in order to consolidate his power, he's going to wipe out all the other mafia heads. And as you hear the organ playing in the church, and the priest asks Michael Corleone, "Do you renounce Satan and all of his works?" And Michael says, "I do renounce them." And the camera's showing you they're going and they're whacking Mo Green, and they're getting this guy and the other guy. That's exactly what the Rabbi is describing here, although this essay was written before The Godfather. That's a view of a kind of dualistic homo religiosus. Even if you presume that Michael Corleone was sincere when he stood in the church, but if you live with that kind of split personality, that religious split personality, so you can be a mafioso on the outside and a good Catholic on the inside. That is not the way of the halakha. Halakhic man suffers from no schizophrenia. That is an affliction of homo religiosus. Halakha, however, rejects such a personality split, such a spiritual schizophrenia. Does not differentiate between the man who stands in his house of worship, engaged in ritual activities, and the mortal who must wage the arduous battle with life. The halakha declares that man stands before God, not only in the synagogue, but also in the Reshut HaRabim, in the public domain, in his house, while on a journey, while lying down, at every moment of life, from waking to sleeping, and everything in between. Now, the top of page 94, we're nearing the end. The primary difference between Halakhic Man and homo religiosus is that while the latter, homo religiosus, prefers the spirit to the body, the soul to its mortal frame, as the main actor in the religious drama, Halakhic Man, as has been stated above, wishes to sanctify the physical, biological, concrete man as the hero and protagonist of religious life. We do not reject our physical selves, but we seek to not escape it, but to sanctify it. And then again, this is really somewhat summarizing earlier themes. Homo religiosus sees ritual, sees mitzvot in our language, or ritual in the language of other faith cultures. Ritual is some kind of non-rational religious act whose whole purpose is to lift man up from a concrete reality to a celestial realm. That is totally foreign to Judaism, or at least it's totally foreign to the Judaism of Halakhic Man. According to the outlook of Halakha, the service of God, with the exception of the study of Torah, that's an important parenthesis, the service of God can be carried out only through implementation. It's not some kind of hocus pocus. The actualization of its principles in the real world. The parenthesis was to tell you that in terms of Torah study, we have this notion of the value of even abstract Torah study. That if you study halachot that are not practical at the moment, it still has independent value. But other mitzvot, it's only about getting it done. The ideal of righteousness is the guiding light of his worldview. Halakhic man's most fervent desire is the perfection of the world under the dominion of righteousness and loving kindness. The realization of the a priori ideal creation, whose name is Torah or halakha, in the realm of concrete life. The halakha is not hermetically enclosed within the confines of the cult sanctuary. The halakha is not only about the synagogue. It's not only about the Beit HaMikdash, but penetrates into every nook and cranny of life. The marketplace, the street, the factory, the house, the meeting place, the banquet hall, all constitute the backdrop for religious life. The synagogue does not occupy a central place in Judaism. That's an interesting line, of course, but I'm not going to dwell on that. But let me just say one other thing, that, of course, here we are, we're a few days before Tisha B'Av, when we mourn the loss of the Beit HaMikdash. But of course, what's more interesting than the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and of course all of our national mourning that's connected with that, these many, many, many years later, 2,000 years later, is the remarkable longevity of Judaism despite the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. Because the Beit HaMikdash, important as it was, as a place where many mitzvot were carried out, as a place where one form of worship, perhaps the ideal form of worship, was executed, the Beit HaMikdash was not the be-all and end-all of Judaism. Because the halakha, if the halakha were identified solely with the Beit HaMikdash, with the Jerusalem temple, then when the temple had been destroyed, that would have been the end of Judaism. But even without the Beit HaMikdash, the halakha has plenty of work to do. There are plenty of other nooks and crannies where it can exercise itself. And we were able to reorient and refocus certain things within Judaism, primarily on the role of Talmud Torah, on the role of prayer over sacrifice, and the halakha was able to continue, Judaism was able to continue, even in the absence, over these many years, even in the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. That's what he means that the synagogue does not occupy a central place in Judaism, that because it does obviously occupy a central place in Judaism, an important place in Judaism. But the halakha is not trapped within the synagogue. It's not trapped within the Beit HaMikdash or the Beit HaKnesset, or even the Beit HaMidrash, which is its natural home. Because the halakha is equally applicable in every place and in every circumstance. And now we return to one final theme, of the degree to which there's a kind of polemical argument going on here in the essay, which I mentioned earlier. When liberal Judaism, here he's talking principally about Reform and Conservative Judaism, when liberal Judaism expelled the Shekhinah, the divine presence, from the broad arena of Jewish life, it set aside a special place for it in the temple. Now, I've mentioned many times the degree to which the Rav's critique of the liberal denominations of Judaism, and again, the essay is written in the 1940s, it's tied to a very specific reality. He's addressing an audience in a very specific moment of American Jewish history, at a very specific crisis moment for Orthodoxy. But the critique on the liberal movements in Judaism is also tied into his larger critique of American religion. That, again, is the famous fourth footnote. And the degree to which conservative and Reform Judaism have deliberately modeled or had deliberately modeled themselves after American Protestantism is a critique that he's making on larger trends in American religion, not just within Judaism. But that idea that the synagogue, that our Judaism is limited to the synagogue, is precisely the problem. By setting a special place for it in the temple. Here, the temple meaning not the Beit HaMikdash, but the temple, the Reform and Conservative house of worship. I remember, even as a kid, I grew up in an Orthodox shul that was an Orthodox shul of a certain era, with an almost exclusively non-Orthodox population. Overwhelming majority of people drove to shul on Shabbos and parked around the corner and walked, and everyone understood what that was. It was a kind of don't ask, don't tell. The synagogue had a mechitza, a rather low mechitza at the time, and it had a Orthodox rabbi who was very kind and compassionate and well-loved, but everyone understood he wasn't going to tell them that they're going to burn in the fires of hell for their non-Orthodox lifestyle, because that was the culture of the place at the time. There were these one of those bins, one of those yarmulke bins, and you walked in and you'd get a yarmulke, one of those like satiny. I'm sure if you go there now, you can still find one that is made of like a kind of blue velvet, and inside it's stamped from the bar mitzvah of Jeffrey Sachs. And on the box it said, "Please return yarmulkes here before leaving the synagogue." And I remember thinking that it was like a little strange, because after all, it was an Orthodox shul, and like if you would have asked the rabbi, like, should I wear a yarmulke all the time, he would have certainly encouraged it, to wear a kippah. But that idea that, like, the yarmulke is like something that you wear when you come into shul. You pick one up on the way in, and you leave it by the door on your way out. That's an indication of something that was wrong in American Judaism. The halakha, the Judaism that is faithful to itself, however, which brings the divine presence into the midst of empirical reality, right? We're not about concentrating a tzimtzum of Judaism into the shul. We're about an expansion of the halakha out into the world. So that halakha does not center about the synagogue or study house. These are minor mikdash ma'at, minor sanctuaries. The true sanctuary, the true mikdash, is the sphere of our daily mundane activities. Right? It's one thing to be halachic when you're in shul or in the Beit Midrash. It's another thing to be halachic when you're in your workplace, when you're in the privacy of your intimate affairs. For it is there that the realization of the halakha takes place. The great Torah giants, the true Halakhic men, were indeed champions of truth and justice. because halakha is truth, and it leads you to an ethical outcome. They glowed with resplendent ethical beauty. Space doesn't permit me to even begin to speak, for example, about Reb Chaim, again, Baruch's grandfather, unrelenting efforts to realize the ideal of righteousness and equity. Then he tells this story about once in Brisk, there were two people who died on the same day. One was very rich and one was very poor. And the halakha is that when two people die, the Chevra Kadisha has to deal with first come, first served. The person who died first gets buried first, and then they go and deal with the second one. So it happened that the poor person died first, but the Chevra Kadisha, out of fear or out of some other desire, twisted the din. And we're dealing with the rich man first, because, sometimes rich men cut to the front of the line, even when it's that last line of their life. And Reb Chaim went, and he told the Chevra Kadisha, he told the burial society they can't do it. They didn't listen to him. Reb Chaim then rose, took his walking stick, trudged over to the house of the deceased, of the rich man, and chased all the attendants outside. Reb Chaim prevailed. The poor man was buried before the rich man. Reb Chaim's enemies multiplied and increased. Thus have true halakhic men always acted, for their study and their deeds have blended together beautifully, truly beautifully. Limud v'ma'aseh. Remember, the Gemara in Kedushin has a kind of theoretical argument, theoretical discussion. What is greater, limud or ma'aseh, study or action? On one plane, you imagine the discussion being, well, look, in other words, you have to do mitzvot, but you also have to learn Torah all the time. So what if learning Torah all the time comes in the way of doing mitzvot? Like you have to daven, like it's coming up on the sunset, and you have to daven mincha before the shkia. But that means you have to stop learning. So which should take precedence? You have to learn. So you're learning Sechet Sukkah. But it's time to go sit in the sukkah or to shake the lulav. So let's just learn. So this question of the conflict between study, which is more of an abstract endeavor, and ma'aseh, actually putting the Torah into action. So the Gemara debates which takes precedence. And the conclusion, of course, in typical Talmudic fashion, where we split the difference, is to say that Talmud is greater, Shalimud mevi l'dem ma'aseh, because study leads to action. If you learn Masechet Sukkah, you're going to want to shake the lulav. If you absorb the halakha, you're going to want to be the ish chesed. You're going to want to do the right thing. You're going to want to go out and help the orphan and the widow and the poor person and the nachshlepper and the shoemaker, and make sure that the rich people aren't oppressing the poor, because that's the implementation of the halakha. That's the kiyum of the halakha in this world, and that is what the halakhic man is about. It's about bringing this ideal Torah from heaven and implementing it in this world. Implementing in this world in the literal sense of opening up Or Chaim and knowing how to put on the tefillin and how to shake the lulav and how to eat the matzah, but also, and no less so, on the ethical plane. That's the theme of this last chapter. On the ethical plane that the halakha represents, and that is marked first and foremost by truth, by getting it right. By getting it right. And that is the mark of halakhic man's worldview and his life. In the subsequent section, the Rav focuses on this issue of creativity, and that will be the topic of our discussion. But for now, we have concluded Tam Velo Nishlam, the first section, the first 15 chapters of Halakhic Man, which we have endeavored to explore over the course of this academic year at WebYeshiva, 2013-14. And it has been a great pleasure and privilege for me. I know that many of you are listening to the archives. If you are if you have been participating by the archives, or if you're at some point in the future, maybe years hence, listen to the archives, I'm still very happy to get your comments and questions. There's my email, jeffreysachs@gmail.com. And I hope that we will be able to study together when we meet again in about a month, and to continue to finish the final section of the essay. And I do hope, of course, that when we do meet again together, we will all be experiencing much more peaceful times. So thank you to all of you. Thank you especially to Bina Chana in Germany, who's been probably our most ardent student. I think she hasn't even missed a session, so we'll give her the award. And we will hopefully continue again soon. Shabbat Shalom.